Hello, my name is Joel Schultes, and I'm going to be presenting to you today on the Colorado Fluvial Hazard Mapping Program. This is a program that is developed and administered by the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and my co-authors are Michael Blazevich of Round River Design, Katie Yacht of Watershed Science and Design, and Chris Sturm with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So I'll jump to the bottom line up front. Streams are dynamic and they require space. They are corridors and not simply lines like a center line or the channel margins. What I'm presenting on today is a way to define the space they can occupy and influence as they move across their corridors over time. And this exists, this method exists, this reality exists for better or worse. And the reason we say better for worse is that, well, the fluvial hazard zone map is a different kind of hazard map. It's not a floodplain inundation map. And it potentially identifies areas of land that are not identified by the 100-year floodplain map, the FEMA map. That could potentially cause some consternation in communities for specific landowners. But the better part of this is that we're communicating a hazard that already exists. This is not creating a new hazard, obviously. And so this is new information that can be used to guide development decisions in the floodplain. This effort came out of the 2013 flood event. This is an image from Lyons looking out east, and we can see the St. Vrain River here moved quite a bit. The channel moved into a lot of buildings and homes. It also deposited a lot of sediment. And so we had erosion and deposition that happened to create a very dynamic situation that influenced a very wide swath of the river corridor. Of course, this is nothing new in Colorado. We've had a lot of fluvial geomorphic hazards occur in the state. This is a picture from Denver. I'm not sure if this is Cherry Creek or the South Platte, but there's a lot of rivers that go through and can flood and also erode and move as a result of floods. Of course, we have more recent history here. This is the Big Thompson River in Drake in the canyon. And we had the 1976 flood event that was localized to the Big Thompson drainage. And then, of course, in 2013, a very similar result happened there, where the Big Thompson River and the North Fork of the Big Thompson come in together. Now, we're not always looking at the Front Range for dynamic rivers. Rivers are dynamic anywhere. And so if we look at our snowmelt rivers that have a lower gradient, we also have dynamism and movement. It just happens at a more gradual, typically gradual time scale. Here's the Rio Grande in the San Luis Valley, and you can see in the background some historic channels where the river used to occupy. In the foreground is the current channel. And the river moves quite a bit across its meander belt, its floodplain, where it might erode bends and create point bars over time naturally, as well as abandon channels and find new routes across the floodplain. So let's define the fluvial hazard zone. It is the zone in which a stream has occupied in recent history, may occupy, or may physically influence as the stream transports water, sediment, and debris. Now, floodplain mapping, the typical inundation mapping that we're used to, considers simply what gets wet. So fluvial hazard zones obviously care about water, but we're also incorporating sediment transport and deposition, as well as debris, typically large wood, that can influence the fluvial hazard zone. So these fluvial geomorphic processes may occur gradually over years or acutely during a flood event. And the primary objective of the mapping of fluvial hazard zones in Colorado is to identify these areas that are vulnerable to fluvial geomorphic hazards. We want to characterize these hazards and then map them to reduce risk to life and safety through avoidance and mitigation. Now, here's the protocol itself. It's just published from its draft form. It's in its final form as of this August. And you can download this protocol at coloradofhz.com. We'll talk about the primary components that make up the fluvial hazard corridor, or fluvial hazard zone. The first is the active stream corridor. And this is the yellow line here. It delineates what we can think of as the geomorphic floodplain, the contemporary floodplain in which the river is moving and influencing over time. And it's bounded by the valley margins, like kind of toes of terraces, hill slopes, as well as fans that might confine that valley margin. We then have the fluvial hazard buffer, and that is the buffer that extends beyond the active stream corridor into hill slopes, into terraces. And the reason why we delineate this is because we might have a structure, infrastructure that is thought to be high and dry, but it's in an erodible margin. And if the river were to erode into that margin, we could have mass wasting failure or fluvial scour that could undermine that infrastructure or development. We have avulsion hazard zones. Now, an avulsion is where a river moves from its current kind of floodplain area into another area. And we don't have that pictured here, but the idea is if the river could move outside of its active stream corridor to find a new route across the floodplain, maybe in an old relic channel or something like that, we want to identify those locations where that potentially could occur. We designate fans. These could be debris fans, alluvial fans that are adjacent to the fluvial hazard zone. We use that just with a flag or a triangle to designate that they exist or not delineate them specifically. And the Colorado Geologic Survey has the capability of mapping the actual extent of fans and characterizing their hazards for communities. So that's outside of the scope of this. We have geotechnical flags where we have really steep hill slopes where mass wasting and fluvial scour could cause really big kind of hill slope failures that could extend beyond the fluvial hazard buffer. And then disconnected active stream corridors where we might have major infrastructure like a federal interstate that could cut off what normally or formerly had been the floodplain. So today we'll be focusing on the active stream corridor, which is the primary component, as well as the fluvial hazard buffer. So a quick comparison between fluvial hazard zones and floodplain inundation maps and models. The fluvial hazard zone is not a model. It is a interpretation of data. It's LiDAR data, hydrology data, geologic data, among others, to identify these zones where we have fluvial geomorphic hazards. So fluvial refers to rivers, and geomorphic refers to the form of the morphology of the landscape. So we're talking about where river movement could influence the form of the landscape. Floodplain models, as many of you are aware, and maps are generated from a hydraulic models that then map what could get wet during a 1% annual exceedance probability flood or the like. So what could get wet is much different than what could be influenced by river movement. And so these are static maps, and they're related to a magnitude and frequency of a flood event. And these maps account for dynamism. Granted, they are a static map, but it accounts for dynamism of the river within its corridor. And it's not tied to a specific annual exceedance probability frequency. Another look at this, if we had a narrow valley where up top, where we have a relatively confined river corridor, the inundation extent would be pretty narrow because that water is just going to go to the edge of the hill slope. The fluvial hazard zone, however, would extend up into the hill slope a little ways using that fluvial hazard buffer. And so here the fluvial hazard zone would be wider than the inundation zone. If we go to a less confined valley where the floodplain is much broader, then the fluvial hazard zone potentially could be much more confined to this meander belt around where the channel is, accounting for downstream and across valley migration. However, the inundation extent in this example could be much wider if we have a big enough flood event, given the frequency, that it would actually flood from valley toe to valley toe. So they could be narrower or wider depending on the situation. So to map the fluvial hazard zone, first we need to think about processes. There's a lot of different processes to account for. One is the kind of balance of energy flow and dissipation through a river reach. As floodwaters enter a reach, they're going to interact with a lot of elements within the channel and floodplain. That could include moving energy expended on the bed and margins of the channel by erosion and deposition. We could have energy expended via turbulence as it moves through the channel. And then when flow moves to the floodplain, it's going to interact with floodplain roughness elements, trees, debris, rocks, and vegetation. So that energy could be either expended as work by moving sediment, depositing sediment, or overall losing energy via the roughness. If we think about sediment continuity, this is really important for understanding fluvial hazards. If we look at a confined reach, maybe this is upstream in the hill slopes, canyon kind of reaches, we have a lot of coupling with the hill slopes. We have a channel, and during a flood event, that channel could in size and widen and recruit sediment within the channel. It could interact with debris flow. So maybe we have debris flows that are active and deposit sediment in the channel, which is moved downstream, or the channel could erode the hill slope margin. So there's a lot more opportunity for sediment recruitment in these more confined and steep reaches of the foothills and kind of mountains. So a net loss or net degradation of sediment might occur. And then as we move downstream into the Piedmont and plains types of settings, maybe we have a broader floodplain, and that sediment could come out into deposition on the floodplain into point bars or islands. We also recruit sediment in these areas from bank erosion and potentially floodplain scour as well. Here upstream, that might be net erosional, and downstream we might be net depositional or maybe balanced as coarse sediment falls out and maybe more finer sediment is recruited. So another part of mapping the fluvial hazard zone is understanding context, and this context plays out at many scales. The first thing I'll talk about is geologic context. Fortunately, in Colorado, we have a lot of great geologic maps. They're limited to the 1 to 24,000 scale at the finest resolution. Those are not available for every area in the state. What these geologic maps can tell us is not necessarily where to draw a boundary for a fluvial hazard zone because of that coarse scale. We're using LiDAR data more specifically to draw those boundaries. However, we can identify what geologic units we have that bound our river corridor and form the river corridor, how erodible they are, and how old they might be. Here I have a geologic map of East Plum Creek near Castle Rock. This geologic map shows us that we have a lot of quaternary deposits, so that's QTs, QAs. These are deposited after the last glaciation, likely. And again, I'm not a geologist, so I'm going to be speaking a little bit outside of my expertise here. But we can use these to identify the age. These have different ages associated with them. They're different terraces. And also how erodible they are. So if these are alluvial deposits, they're not consolidated like a sandstone or something like that, a shellstone, then they're going to be more erodible. And we can also identify the fact that the river is incising and creating lots of different terraces. So it's slowly a net degradational environment over the last tens of thousands of years. So this is important information to use then to identify how erodible our river corridor is going to be. And also in this case, we have a lot of fine erodible sediment supply available for a potentially dynamic river. Another important part of the context is the hydrologic context. Given the great variety of topography that Colorado has, quite a different range of flood intensities of flood hydroclimatology across the state. I'm showing a map of flood intensity, and this is generated from USGS stream gauges where we have peak flow data. And all I did here was simply take the largest flood event that happened at a gauge and divided that by the average of the flood magnitude. So where you see these purple dots, we've had a flood intensity of 4 or greater, up to 30, and that just means that the flood event that occurred at that gauge is 4 times the average flood event. You can see a lot of these purple dots are concentrated on the Front Range in the Arkansas River Basin, although we do have instances of intense floods occurring elsewhere in the state, especially when it comes to smaller drainages that could have really intense rainfall events. Then a final piece I'll talk about for context, and I'm not covering them all, is the geomorphic context, and this plays out at different scales. At the landscape scale, we have, are you in the headwaters, are you kind of midway in the foothills, or are you downstream, maybe on the plains, or an area that's very distal to the source of the headwaters. So that's a landscape scale. We could also think about geomorphology playing out on the reach scale as well, and even point bar to pool type of scale. Here we see that geomorphic hazards play out differently depending on where you are in the landscape. If you're in the headwaters, as I talked about earlier, you might be net degradational. We might have a lot of erosion, a lot of sediment recruitment from the hill slopes. And so how much coarse sediment you have in play informs the types of fluvial hazards that you could experience in this area. As you move downstream, maybe you could move into kind of more partially confined valleys. We're no longer necessarily accumulating sediment and eroding it from the beds. Certainly the river could be moving, but we more have a response type of scenario where meander migrations occurring. We have deposition, erosion. There's a lot more at play potentially in this zone as sediments deposited and recruited. And then finally, as we move to unconfined settings, we have more of a net accumulation zone. The fluvial hazards are going to be more related to meander migration, as well as potentially avulsion. And here's an example of an avulsion that happened near Greeley from the 2013 floods. All right, so now that we've covered kind of context and process just a little bit, let's talk about actually doing some mapping. And the first part of that is mapping the active stream corridor. What you're seeing here is a line that's delineating the active stream corridor for the South St. Vrain Creek upstream of Lyons. And the aerial image is from 2012 prior to the 2013 flood event. Now here's what happened as a result of the 2013 flood event. And you can see that the active stream corridor actually captures a lot of that dynamism where the channel moved, it braided, and changed quite a bit. I'll just go back. You can see that the channel hugs kind of the northern part of that boundary, and it moved quite a bit going to the southern part of the boundary as a result of that flood event. So to map the active stream corridor, we actually have 4 different protocols or methodologies to do that depending on the type of river. The first step is, do we have an urban river? Is it kind of confined by a lot of armoring, revetment, channelization, and development in the floodplain? So we've got an actual very specific list of criteria that it needs to meet to be considered an urban reach. Then we want to know, is it a headwater reach? If it is a headwater reach, meaning it's got a small drainage area, it's a very narrow corridor, that it'd be hard to delineate using LiDAR data, then we have a headwater protocol that just deals with a specific kind of setback. Once we've made those determinations, we want to look at the valley type. What's the confinement of the channel by the valley margins? Are we really constricted narrow valley, or do we have a big unconfined valley? And then that'll influence then either if we do the fluvial signature protocol, which is kind of the bread and butter, which I'll talk about, or the meander belt protocol, which is a slightly different approach to identifying the active stream corridor. So let's talk about the fluvial signature protocol. This is kind of the, like I said, the bread and butter. We're going to be using this in most instances where we have, confined, semi-confined, even to unconfined river corridors. And it's based on using a relative elevation model. So we need LiDAR data. So we need that high resolution digital elevation model. And then we can make a relative elevation model based off of that. This is where we cut a lot of cross sections and detrend that model. So that's basically flat across the river corridor. And then every pixel in this relative elevation model tells us how high we are above the channel itself in the vicinity of that channel. So we can color code that and identify contours that we think match with what we need to determine as the valley margin. So the valley margin could be pretty obvious. It's where the valley goes really straight up, but we might be dealing with a lot of fans and terraces and stuff like that. So it might be a little more complicated to determine. We provide a lot of guidance for how to delineate that margin in the protocol. So ultimately, we pick some contours that might change reach to reach and identify this edge where the valley margin is. Here you can see it's going through a fan. This is a highly erodible fan based on some sand deposition. So based on field verification, there is a field component to this. We go out and figure out what we think is in and out. And so in this case, because this fan is pretty erodible, even though it's high, we're calling it in. So we also have the meander belt width approach, which I don't have time to discuss today. And then the urban approach, that is based on estimating stream power and identifying a corridor that the river could erode out to accommodate a certain stream power. And then we also have a headwaters approach, which I talked about. This is a kind of a basic setback for these smaller channels. The meander belt width approach, this is based on the idea that flatter rivers with kind of mild slope valleys that are not confined by valley margins are going to have this corridor within which the river is going to want to migrate downstream and across valley. And so we can identify the belt within which that migration corridor should exist, that we should avoid for different activities. So we talked a little bit about the active stream corridor. Now let's talk about the fluvial hazard buffer, which extends from outside of the active stream corridor. The fluvial hazard buffer is this area that the river could erode into, either from scour or that maybe that scour results in a mass wasting event. Here's an example of where you can see the extent of the pre-flood hillside. And from the 2013 flood in the Big Thompson Canyon, we had a pretty big erosion of that toe. So these homes that you can see here that were eroded into, unfortunately, they were probably outside of the 100-year floodplain, the 1% AEP floodplain, and maybe they didn't have flood insurance. However, they were still in a hazardous area because of this potential to erode the hill slope. So by mapping the fluvial hazard zone in this area, we could have, these homeowners and any other infrastructure could have known that they were in a hazardous zone, even though they thought they might have been high and dry based on a FEMA floodplain map alone. So we have different methods for mapping the fluvial hazard zone based on different kinds of rivers. The kind of main one that I'll talk about is called Type 1 for Front Range and Piedmont streams, as well as smaller drainages across the state. This is based off of confinement ratio. So here we have confined channels where the valley width divided by the channel width is less than 5. So these are very narrow corridors. We have partially confined and then unconfined. And the fluvial hazard buffer is simply a factor of the average channel width. So we can get the average channel width from GIS. We can then multiply that by 4 to get a fluvial hazard buffer. Here we have 3 for partially confined, 2 times the channel width where we have unconfined settings and the river is really next to the valley margin, and then only 1 channel width when we're far away from the valley margin. Now this came out of a study I did on what actually happened to hill slope erosion from the 2013 flood event on the Front Range. So it's based on data and provides a numeric guidance for delineating the fluvial hazard buffer. There's also a couple other examples or methods for doing this, where we have channels such as East Plum Creek, where you could have wholesale shifting of the active stream corridor into those really erodible margins. We observed that in the 1965 flood. There, you're gonna have a different method and much bigger fluvial hazard buffers. And then we also have larger snowmelt rivers, and those rivers typically aren't making such big erosion into the hill slope, and so we have a different methodology for those types of streams. Let's talk about applications now. We defined the fluvial hazard zone. We talked about how to do some basic mapping. There's a lot more details in the protocol, of course. Let's talk about applications. And the primary one that I'll talk about at first is hazard reduction. We want to delineate the fluvial hazard zone that we can identify areas that would allow the river to accommodate erosion and deposition within its corridor during the flood event, as well as gradually over time. So this allows us to provide more accurate assessments of flood hazards, in addition to FEMA floodplain maps, and can provide defensible delineations for site development and land use planning. Ultimately, we'd like to reduce reliance on methods that try to train and engineer the channel to be where it wants to be, such as channelization, levees, bank armoring. When we do these engineering works, obviously there's areas where we need to protect important infrastructure where we have already a lot of urbanization. At the same time, they're just kind of transferring the problem downstream. So where you riprap a bank in one place, you're going to have some erosion, more erosion potentially where that riprap ends. So ultimately, this could lead to more resilient infrastructure in the river corridor. This helps us identify at-risk infrastructure and critical facilities that exist within the fluvial hazard zone. When we do repairs and replacing of these infrastructure over time, we can avoid the fluvial hazard zone. Maybe we can do setbacks and the like so that we're out of these hazardous corridors and site new infrastructure in less hazardous areas. Ultimately, the goal would be to reduce maintenance and repair costs. When you have infrastructure in the river corridor, sometimes it's necessary, right? And we need to protect that and kind of double down on that fight. But there might be areas where over time we can kind of slowly retreat and reduce our exposure to these hazards. We've got a lot of fires going on right now. Hopefully they'll be put out soon by this weather we're having. After fires, we know that we have often catastrophic flooding, debris flows, a lot of sediment movement. This results in fluvial geomorphic hazards. So if we can map fluvial hazard zones in areas that we know have burned recently or could burn in the future, where we might have communities downstream, then we can identify these zones and kind of be ready and have maps on the ground for when that fire does happen and be prepared to identify facilities that could be in harm's way. So here's an example of Spring Creek that was mapped after the fire that they had there with critical infrastructure identified that could be impacted by fluvial hazards. Mapping the fluvial hazard zone can be used for regulatory support, can be adopted into ordinances, can be adopted into floodplain permitting and the like. By managing fluvial hazards, we can reduce our community's exposure to hazards in the river corridor and avoid situations where people are building, right on the stream. And finally, we want to think about communicating these hazards, right? We have floodplain maps. Everyone's familiar with those. This is another tool that can inform people about river processes and how we can best live as good neighbors with our rivers. Fluvial hazards exist by mapping them. We're not creating new hazards. We're simply communicating this hazard information so that we can have informed decision making. If you want to find out more about fluvial hazards, again, visit coloradofhz.com. We've got a lot of good resources there where you can get the documents that I've talked about. So let's take a look at that really quickly. We've got a fact sheet that kind of gives you a bullet list of what this program is, what the maps are, a quick start guide about if you're a community and you want to make this happen for your community, how do I get that done? As well as some model ordinance that gives you some language you might use and adopt. The protocol itself is posted. This is version 1.0, it's finalized. And we've got a relative elevation model tool that you can plug into ArcMap to actually develop the relative elevation models that are kind of the bread and butter for mapping fluvial hazard zones. I want to thank you for your time and your attention. This is our contact information. And again, the website for finding out more information here.